Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another video, and in this video we are going to be covering some more of our input elements in HTML. Now before we get started, I do want to broach the subject of the image input type that we covered last video. As you saw, it was having some problems where it submitted the form rather than doing what it was supposed to do. And what it was supposed to do was it was supposed to bring up a file, an open file dialog to allow the user to select images from their computer, but for some reason unknown to me, it did not do that. It submitted the form instead. So just an FYI, that's what it was supposed to do, but it did not do that. It did something entirely different. It did the function of the submit type instead of the image. So, with that being said, let's get into the new input types that we're going to cover today. We're going to cover the radio button input type. We're going to cover the month type. We're going to cover the number type, and so on. So, let's go ahead and take a look at our code right now. Right now, you can see I have all the different types we're going to look at today listed above these two break tags. So we got radio, number, password, month, and yeah. So if we go down below these tags, or rather these three break tags, I should have said, but if you go here, let's take a look at the radio button first. Now, radio buttons are kind of unique because radio buttons only are like checkboxes. They have a checked state, but you can only have one radio button selected out of a group of radio buttons at any given point. And so that brings up an interesting dilemma. How exactly do we implement that then? How do we implement that functionality? Well, that's simple. Each radio button input that we want to be put into a group of radio buttons, they all have to have the same name attribute. So, for example, let's say you want the user to select their card type for a payment page. Then each of those radio buttons would have the name of payment-type or something. So that way you can switch, you can like toggle between Visa, MasterCard, American Express, etc., rather than like trying to do all this JavaScript if statements to figure out which checkbox is selected and unselect all the others and all that stuff, you know. Use a radio button instead. Okay, so let's take a look at a radio button first. So we're gonna say input type equals, and inside of our type attribute, we're gonna put radio. Okay. And now we're gonna have a ID. This is going to be Visa-option. And we're gonna have a name. And this name is going to be payment-method. Okay, so now that we have that typed out, let's save our code and reload the browser. Okay, so now in the browser you can see that we have a radio button here. It doesn't have a label. And we can check the radio button, but we cannot uncheck it. Okay, so when you just have a radio button like this with no label, a screen reader will announce radio button unchecked or radio button checked, that kind of stuff. just like the checkbox, you can include the checked attribute, and it will check the box by default for you. If you don't want it to be checked by default, don't include the attribute. So let's go ahead and add a label to this radio button. We'll say label for equals Visa option. I believe that's what we set our ID for. Yep. Okay. Then we can, inside the label, say Visa like that. Save your code and run it. And now we have a radio button with the label of Visa. And just like with every other thing, if we click on the label, we can also toggle it that way. Now, of course, if you don't like your radio button on the right side of the label and you want the label on the right side of the radio button, just put the label below the input element in the code, and you should be able to do it that way, and it won't be that much of a problem. Okay. So now let's talk about using multiple radio buttons. Right? Radio buttons are generally meant to be put in groups rather than singular radio buttons like we have right now. So inside our code then, let's create a couple more radio buttons for MasterCard, American Express, PayPal, and Apple Pay. So we're going to have label for, or we'll call this MC option. MasterCard. And then again, we have our input. So inputs type equals radio, ID equals MC option, and then we have the name. So up above, for our first radio button, we set the name to payment type, or payment dash type, and that is what we're going to put the name for this element as well, because again, for a radio button, in order to have individual radio buttons clustered into a group, so you can use arrow keys to select the different radio buttons and all that stuff, to toggle between them, they have to have the same name. So name equals payment type. Okay, that's the second radio button. Next, we can do label for equals PP option for PayPal. PayPal, like that. And we're kind of blazing through this because I've done basically all the explaining for the input element, how you type it already. So you should be able to go along with me. If you don't understand it right now, that's fine. We will, at the end of the video, I will go through it again. But then we'll have the inputs type equals radio, ID equals PP option, and name equals payment dash type. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here is we're going to have another radio button, but I'm going to make a purposeful typo in the name just to demonstrate to you what happens when you don't have the same name and how easy that typo can be to make, because I want to make a point of I want to make sure that point is drilled into your head, because it is a very important point. So label for equals AP option for Apple Pay. Apple Pay. And then label, not label, we want input type equals radio. ID equals AP option. And then the name equals payment dash TPE. Very simple typo to make, and I have actually made this typo myself every now and again. I've made typos in the names of radio buttons and have gotten a undesirable result. So let's go ahead now and save our code and run it. So now you can see we have all these different radio buttons. They're all inline because, again, the input element is an inline element. In CSS, you can change that. That's not an issue. So let's go ahead and focus on our radio buttons. Check one, so it's checked. And we can, in some cases, you can use the arrow keys to change the radio button's values, but sometimes not so much. Some browsers you can't. So let's go ahead then, if I can find my cursor. Let's go ahead then and click then on MasterCard. And you can see something is up here, huh? You can see something isn't right. And then PayPal isn't even focusable. So let's take a look at our code then, shall we? So let's go ahead . So you can see here that you can use, as you saw on the webpage, some of these weren't exactly the same. All right, so let's go to these inputs. Okay. And you can see I already made a mistake. Instead of payment method, I said payment type. So you can see how easy it is to mess something up. And so let's go ahead and change that. Go to the name of each of your elements and change them. So payment, and change type to method. So METHOD. Okay, and so now let's go ahead and save that and reload the page. Okay, so now you see we have the Visa radio button checked. Right, and so if I can find my cursor here, let's go ahead and click MasterCard. And now Visa is unchecked, but MasterCard is checked. And let's then check PayPal. Same thing happens. MasterCard is now unchecked and PayPal is checked. And then we can now also try Apple Pay. And the Apple Pay radio button is now checked and none of the others are. That is how a radio group, radio buttons are supposed to work. So, as I mentioned before, just, keep an eye on your name attributes and make sure they're the same. Otherwise, you're going to have some funkiness like we just had before. So, with that all cleared up and that demonstration out of the way, let's go briefly into review mode and talk about what we did for our radio button. So, to create a radio button in review, you need the input element, have the type attribute set to radio, give it an ID for its label, so you can associate the label with it and all that stuff using the label element. Then you need to have the name attribute. Make sure, again, that the name is the same as all the other radio buttons in the group. Otherwise, you're going to experience some funkiness and it's just not going to work right. And that pretty much, and that's it for creating a radio button. Now, if we let's see, we can now go ahead and get rid of these radio buttons. Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of try to get rid of these. Okay. Now that we have the radio buttons out of the way, let's take a look at input type number. Now, this input will give you the ability to use up and down buttons to change the number displayed in a field. Now, you can change the increment that it uses using an attribute, but we will not look at that today. We're just going to look at the input element itself and see what exactly it does. I will leave that to you to go to the MDN web docs or some other place on Google and figure out, how do I change the increment and decrement values for the input type number HTML element, to give you some practice on Googling your problems and finding solutions. Every developer should know how to do that. So, to create the input type number, first off, we need our label because, well, at this point, why wouldn't you put a label on your input? So for equals test-num, and then we'll have test number input. Okay. Then we're going to do our actual input element. So less than input type equals, and in between these quotes, you're going to put number. So number, like that. Make sure it has an ID of test-num. Give it a name of num, and boom. Okay, that'll do our greater than sign, and there we go. That's it. Save your code, go back to your browser, and here we are. Here's our test number input. You can see that on some browsers, it will show those up and down arrows. Others, it will not. On iOS, it does. I know for a fact it does. And on others, they won't show, but you hover over the field and then they show. Right? So it just depends on the browser manufacturer's implementation. So let's focus on the field. You can see when we're focused on the field, the arrow buttons show. And the browser with a screen reader will interpret this as a spin button, which technically it is. So, how do we interact with this? Well, you can try. You can certainly try to put anything other than numbers in this field, but it will not let you. As you can see here, I'm trying to type some letters and it won't do it. But if you type a number, it works just fine. About the only non-numeric character that it lets you put in the field is a dot. But the big thing about that is it will only allow one dot. So that's good for validation. For example, if you need to input some kind of decimal value, it won't allow more than one decimal. So you could do something like, say, 555.45. Right? But any other decimal points you try to put in there, it won't do it. You can also increment the value that you have in there by using your up and down arrows. So you can see its increment value is 1 by default. You can, like I said, change it if you so desired, but for now, that's not what we're going to do. Okay? All right, so let's take a look then at the next input type. And the next input type is password. This is, as the name implies, a secure field for passwords. You can also use these type of inputs for things like credit card numbers, debit card numbers, social security numbers, CVV numbers on the back of debit and credit cards, that kind of stuff. Anything that is sensitive information, you should always use a password input type. Granted, that's not going to obscure it in the HTTP request to the server when you send it out to the server, but on the client, if someone is, say, looking over your shoulder, or if someone is hacked in to your computer and they're stupid enough not to use a keylogger, they're not going to see what you're typing into those fields. When you send the form data to the server, then you'll have to do some additional security work to ensure that that request doesn't get intercepted and decoded and all that stuff. That's why HTTPS exists, but that's getting way off topic. So let's go ahead and create our input field, shall we? So first we're going to need a label. So label for, we'll say password, and input type equals excuse me, and then in this type attribute we type password. So type equals password. Then we can give this an ID of pass and a name of password, like that. Now, save your code, go back to your browser, and reload. You can see now we have a text field with the password label. And if you focus on it with a screen reader, it'll say password text field protected. That means that this is a secure field. It will obscure any input you make to it. So you can see all that stuff in there is now, all that stuff in the text field is obscured by dots. And a screen reader will announce that as, say, star, or in VoiceOver's case, it'll just make a sound to indicate, yes, we've inputted something into the field. All right. So that pretty much does it for the password. Let's go back up here. And the last one we're going to cover today is the month input. And this basically allows you to select months out of the year, right? So let's go ahead and do an input. Well, first we need a label. And this for is going to say M. We'll just say M for now. Select a month. Then we'll need the input. So input type equals month, like that. The month goes in the quotation marks for the type. Then we need the ID of M and the name of M. Now keep in mind, generally speaking, you do not want to have single letters for your IDs or your names. It just makes things more confusing. So let's go ahead then, and we're going to save our code and reload our browser. And so now you can see this is our month input. We can select a month. So December, November, all kinds of stuff. You can select a year for that month. And you can even show like a dialogue with the month picker that has a year on it as well. Right? So that pretty much is the month input element. It's not exactly a it's not exactly a hard input element to understand. So thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you all in the next video where we'll be covering even more inputs. There's a lot of these things.